God will allow me, I want you to turn to Isaiah 53 just for a moment. F.B. Meyer, one of my favorite writers, said on his deathbed, if I had it to do over again, I would spend the majority of my ministry speaking to hurting people, because most people are hurting in this world. On January 6th of 2022, my Rachel, my wife, the doctor was sitting there, the specialist, across from us in a little small room. She was getting ready to make a statement that changed not only my life, it changed my ministry forever. This lady, so very kind, she looked at me and Rachel. She said, "Ma'am, I need to tell you something. You have a few weeks, a few months at the most. You have a year to live." My wife at the time was 47 years old. We were devastated. But by faith, we believed that God would heal my Rachel. We began to pray. Many of you began to pray in this church, and thousands, literally thousands around this country, missionaries around the world and their congregations. And we believed God. I remember taking Rachel home. We had to tell Adelie. We got in our living room, and us three, we held hands. We made a prayer circle. We began to pray, and we began to believe that God would heal Rachel of her cancer. A few days later, we was in Morgantown, West Virginia, on health near West Virginia University. They began to tell us everything that had to be done. They would say things that we didn't understand, but they told us that there would be a major surgery. We didn't know this at the time, but there was a 9-pound tumor in her stomach. It began with ovarian cancer, 2 tumors in a right ovary. They prepared us for what would take place. A few days later, she had this surgery. And I talked to your pastor. I talked to many preachers, many Christians around this country. And so they began to pray, and we believed God for a miracle. When she had the surgery, it was a 9 to 10 hour surgery that particular day. And this was right after COVID. There were still some restrictions, so I was the only one that could be in the hospital. I remember rolling her bed out of that room, and Joseph, I wanted to pray for my wife. I'm a preacher. I believe I can honestly say this. I know I've prayed for hundreds, possibly thousands of people. As a pastor, as an evangelist, I would pray as they went to surgery. But it was different this time. They rolled her bed away and preparing her for surgery. I walked down as far as I could go. And I remember praying with Dr. McBee, and I said my little prayer. And then they told me I had to leave. I walked back up to that room with no bed, just one chair. And I could look out the window at my own health, and I could see my daughter. The parking lot with her friends and family and preachers in the parking lot. I remember waiting for hours and hours, thinking this will never end. But by faith, I believed God would heal my Rachel. Finally, a few hours later, the nurse came and said, in just a little while, Dr. McBee will be back. You go to this room and you meet him there, and he'll tell you what happened in the surgery. And I ran to that room, and I anticipated him coming, and he finally, the back door opened, and he came, and I was sitting there at the table. He took his mask off, and he shook my hand, and he said, "Dale, the surgery went great." He explained some things that he'd done. They literally had to cut her from the top to the bottom of her body, and to get that large mass out of her stomach. She had a full hysterectomy, and he said, but it really seems like everything went well. He said, certainly we'll have to send this off to the pathology, and it'll take a while, but as soon as we get the results, and she'll heal up here in the hospital, and if she gets enough strength, she'll be able to go home. And it was almost as if he was surprised, and in my mind, I'm thinking, God did it. God healed my wife. God sent a miracle. Everything's going to be okay. And that's exactly what he did. It wasn't 3 days later that my wife Rachel, she had just had 10 hours of surgery. And it wasn't 3 days later. She was up from the bed. She was walking around the hallways. But Pastor, she knew everybody in that hospital. I mean, she would stop in it took us forever to make one lap. She would sit, you had to know Rachel. She'd stop in every room. She'd talk to everybody. Everybody was her friends. The nurses, when they would switch their shifts, they'd always come and say goodbye to Rachel. Everybody loved Rachel. About 2 weeks later, the doctor came in and said, Rachel, you're doing wonderful. We're shocked at what's going on. You can go home. We'll call you when we haven't even got the pathology result back yet, but we'll call you. And when we find that out, we know there's going to be chemotherapy. We know there's going to be treatment, but you just go home and you keep doing what you're doing. And we were praising God, giving God the glory. We got home, and day after day, she began to get strength. She began to get her weight back in her body. A few days later, almost 2 weeks to the day, I was down in my shop, and I was working on my motorcycle. And every time I tell this story, I mention you because you kind of reminded me of this on one of the cruises, and I heard my name. I never thought about this till you said this years ago. Your pastor. I heard my name, and my name's a very simple name. My name is Dale. It's one syllable, but she made it 3 syllables, and only Rachel can say it that way. And I can't even say it, but she hollered my name and with 3 syllables, and I heard that name, and I was in my shop, and I dropped my tools, and I ran up the steps, and I said, "What is it, Rachel? What is it, Rachel?" And she said, "You ain't gonna believe it." I said, "What is it, Rachel?" And she said, "You ain't gonna believe it, Rachel. You got to tell me, or I can't believe it. What is it?" She said, "The doctor called." What did he say, Rachel? He said that what he found in the pathology is what they consider, and many of you that are working in the medical field, you'll know more about this than I do. It's considered precancerous cells. He said, now, I'm not going to accept that. He said, you had a 9-pound tumor in your stomach, so we're going to send it off to Cleveland Clinic and to 2 other major medical institutions, and we're going to try to see something else. I just can't accept these results. And 24 hours later, it came back very swiftly this time. He called back, and he said, it's just precancerous. He said, I'm getting ready to tell you the best news you've had in your life. He didn't know about Jesus, but anyhow, I'm getting ready to tell you the best news you ever had in your life. You're not going to have chemotherapy. You're not going to have any treatment. She hung up the phone. We were giving God the glory. And then for the next few weeks, she began traveling with us. She was testifying everywhere we went. We gave God all the glory. 2 months later, we always go to Arizona. We go out west to a camp, and we try to make a trip. We try to circle literally most of the United States. And Rachel wanted to go, and we really didn't know if she should. It may have been too soon. And so in May of that same year, we went back up to Morgantown, and we said, we want to run all the tests. We want to make sure everything's all right. And the doctors agreed with us. He said, that's a good idea. And they ran every possible test. Every test came back negative. There was no cancer in her body. She was healed. God gave her a miracle. We went out west. We had a wonderful time. I remember the pastor, the missionary friend of mine, he said, now, we want to do something special. Rachel gets to come, and what does Rachel want to do? And I said, well, I'll ask. And once again, you'd have to know my Rachel. And I said, Rachel, what do you want to do? And you got to remember, we're going to the mission field. We're going to see missionaries. I mean, they got 22 kids, and all the girls wear long jean skirts and all that kind of craziness. But anyhow, and I said, Rachel, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to go to Las Vegas, if that's okay. Rachel, now listen to me. We're going to the mission field. I want to go to Las Vegas. That's what I want to do. So I called my missionary friend back. I said, Brian, you know Rachel, she wants to go to Vegas. And he laughed like you did. And so that's what we did. We had our camp, and God moved in that thing in many days on the reservation. And then we went to Las Vegas. And don't act like y'all ain't never been to Vegas. If you've been to Vegas, you know that you got to go through the casino to go shopping. And that's, Miss Becky, that's why Rachel wanted to go, to spend every dollar. If I had any money, it was gone then. But Las Vegas gets very expensive. So we went through all the casinos, and we went shopping. We was on about the 3rd day, and we was all walking, and the 22 kids were walking, and we was trying to keep up with everybody. And here's Rachel and Annalie, the liberals. But anyhow, we were walking through this thing, and next thing I couldn't find Rachel. I said, Brian, the missionary friend, where's Rachel? I haven't seen her. His wife, Miss Luann, she's an Indian from the reservation. Have you seen Rachel? No, I've seen Adley, my daughter. Where's your mom at? And I don't know. I haven't seen her, Dad. And I turned around. It kind of scared me. Maybe something's wrong, and maybe she's not feeling good. And we were walking through a casino. I should have known what she was about to do, but we were walking through the casino, and I said, and I finally, way back over there, I seen her, and she was sitting at she was sitting at a slot machine, and I mean, she had her legs propped up. She didn't have, and I don't mean this to offend anybody. I'm for your convictions. But she didn't have on a jean skirt. She had on bright pink, yellow pants. I mean, and she had these long legs. She had them propped up. She fit right in the place, I'll be honest with you. She had the legs propped up. I ran up, Rachel, what are you doing? We're with the missionaries. This is not our family vacation. And she said, Brother CT's met my dad. Some of you met my dad. Greatest man of God I'll ever know. And just a man, I'm talking suit, tie, white shirt, all that crazy stuff. Shine. And it ain't conviction. He just likes to look sharp. I mean, he just likes to dress fancy. And that was my pastor. And she said, I want you to send this, take a picture of me and send it to your dad. I said, I am not taking a picture and that is our pastor. And you say, what'd you do? I took a picture and I sent it to my mom. She understood a little more than my dad. And that was Rachel. We had a wonderful time. A few days later, we got home. She began to be sick. And it scared me. When they told her on January 6th, my faith was strong. But when they came back in July, they told her cancer had come back. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't even know if I had any faith. I had enough faith to believe I was still saved, but it's about as far as it went. We went back to Morgantown. This will be in July of 22. They said, there's really nothing we can do here. You have to go to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We went into Pittsburgh, walked into that hospital room and scared. Me and Rachel and Adley. The doctor came in. One of the first things he said was, I'm sorry. Ma'am, you're so young. This should not be happening to you. And I don't know where he got a statistic. If you're in the medical field, you probably understand this more than I did. But he said there was a 1 in 1,000 chance for your cancer to come back this way. And he said, you're the one. He began to say of the things and speak of the things, another major surgery they'd have to do. They would use what they consider they would use now, wash treatment, because now the cancer came back in layman's terms as a liquid type cancer, a mucus type cancer, and it was all in her stomach and different things. And they began to explain the surgery. Once again, they would have to open her up again, and they would have to do things, and they would have to do what is considered an exploratory surgery. And so they told her that we would have to schedule this surgery because there needs to be 2 surgeons. And this one, it would be 11 to 12 hours. That's including the treatment. I walked out of that room thinking, God, do you even know me? God, I know I failed you many times. God, I'm trying. God, do you know my wife? I don't know of another person that has so much joy. She loves serving you, God. God, why? Finally, when they was able to schedule the surgery, they took her from the room. She was very sick by this time. Many things happened between now and then. They had to fly her to Pittsburgh. She had to have emergency surgery first. When she got back from this surgery, she had drains, 2 drains. She had an ostomy bag. So many things were happening in her body. She remained in Pittsburgh. And for a while, they let her go home, but it wasn't long before she had to go back because of things that had happened. Day after day, I watched my Rachel slowly die. Brother Joseph, I met her when I was 4 years old. She was 5. I don't know life without Rachel. We grew up together. We went to the same Christian school, that kind of thing. I married her. I wasn't right with God as a teenager. I got so far from God. She should have never even talked to me. God had a plan. Finally, as an 18-year-old boy, I got my heart right with the Lord. And I knew I should marry Rachel. 19 years old, we got married. She was 20. We went off to Bible college. After Bible college, we was able to serve God in our home church. Then God let me pastor the New Life Baptist Church. Then God directed me in a certain direction, leading towards what I'm doing tonight. Not one time did Rachel complain about the ministry. Not one time did I hear her say anything bad about the ministry. Now I'm going every day to the hospital of Pittsburgh, watching her die. I'd go back to my room at night. There was a house that we stayed in, a beautiful house God provided. And I'd lay my head on my pillow, thinking, God, I don't understand this. God, are you sure? As early as they'd let me, I'd go back to the hospital every day. On November 14th of 2022, I walked in the hospital room and the nurse was getting ready to switch her shift. It was almost 7 o'clock and she would go home in a few minutes. She walked right in front of me and she was at the bedside of my wife. She said, before I leave, is there anything I can do? I said, no, ma'am, but I want to ask you a question. She said, anything. They know me. We knew first name basis. We'd been there for months. What is it, Dale? What do you need? And I said, I don't know what I need, but I need to ask you something. I don't understand why Rachel's getting worse and not getting better. Pastor, it was almost as if they were waiting on me to say that. She said, Dale, you need to talk to the head nurse. A few minutes later, the head nurse came, very kind lady. She was a Lutheran, which that's between her and the Lord. And she would, I don't know why, she'd watch me preach on YouTube. And every time she'd hear me preach, she'd say, you're very intelligent. I'm thinking, not really, you just need to read your Bible. But anyhow, but she was a very kind lady. But she came in there that day on November 14th with a team of nurses. Your pastor knows me enough to know this, and some people here, they surrounded me. I didn't like that. She said, Dale, you need to sit down. I didn't want to sit down. But I sat down. And she said, Dale, what do you need? Ma'am, I don't know what I need, but I don't understand why Rachel keeps getting worse every day. By this time, the mucus-type cancer had taken over her body. It was everywhere. I could not touch one part of her body without her being in excruciating pain. She was so beautiful. That cancer had eaten her body. I'll never forget what she told me. Dale, you need to make a decision. And I knew what that meant. I hung my head, I bowed my head because I wanted to pray. That's what we're told. You pray. I couldn't pray. I tried to say anything to God, but I couldn't. Finally lifted up my head. It seemed like an eternity. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. The only thing I knew to tell her was, ma'am, I don't want Rachel to suffer anymore. And she said, that's the right answer. She said, I can't make this decision. The doctor will have to make the decision. She said, but I'll call him and he'll be here not too long from now. She said, you need to talk to your daughter. How am I going to tell Adelie that her mom won't be at her wedding? I've been praying for I know this sounds crazy, but I've been praying for my grandkids ever since Adelie was a baby. I want them to serve God. I want them to live for Jesus. How am I going to tell her that on this earth, her mother will never meet her children? I went to a little tea shop there in Pittsburgh. And when I got there, I ordered my tea and my phone rang. It was a hospital, and they said, you need to come back. The doctor will be here. Me and Adelie ran those 2 blocks, literally. Got up to the room. The doctor wasn't there, but his assistant was there, and a wonderful lady. And she was a Christian. She was a believer. And she said, the doctor's getting ready to go into surgery, but he wanted to personally talk to you. She handed me her phone. He asked the same question, Dale, what do you want to do? I told him the same thing. I don't want her to suffer. And he said the very same words. That's the right answer. He said, Dale, I'm going to tell him to unhook everything. And it won't be very long. I handed the phone back with a feeling of hopelessness. Have I stopped believing in miracles? What I've preached for all these years? Does God not heal anymore? The nurse came to me, said, Dale, if there's anybody who wants to see her, anybody, they need to come within the next few hours. She had no idea how many friends Rachel had. Within 7-8 hours, there were over 30 people in the waiting room trying to get in. And I'd sit there by her side. People say things like this, Brother Dale, I'm praying for you. I'm thinking, what's that mean? My friends would come in, and I got texts and messages from my friends. People would come in that room. Two of them made this statement. Brother Dale, God has a plan. I'm thinking, well, I don't like it. I don't know what that plan is. 6:30, around 5 that morning, my eyes closed. I didn't want to sleep. I don't know if I passed out or I hadn't slept for about 3 days. But my eyes closed. Around 6:30, November 15th, that morning. The nurse came. And she looked at me. And she turned to Adelie. She said, she's passed. Something happened in my body that I've never felt before. I've talked about grief, and I thought I knew what grief was. But I had no idea until that moment. Joseph, I grew up in church. My father, he was a drunk and got saved by the grace of God and dragged me to church even on Tuesday nights. And I love that heritage and that history, and I'm not mad about it. I'm happy about it. But in thousands of church services, oh, they told me about the valley. They told me about the storms of life. And they'd say, preachers say things like this. I'd say things like this. Let's just trust God. I wanted to trust God, but I didn't know how to. They say things like this, just put your faith in God. God, and I believed God could fix it, but I couldn't. I didn't have enough faith to put in there. I'd heard about storms. I've been to the camp meetings. I've been to the Bible conferences. I understand storms. I understand how we walk through the valley, even of the shadow of death. But nobody ever told me how to grieve. Nobody ever took the scripture, told me how I should grieve as a child of God. I began to study. I began to read. I began just for a few moments tonight. I won't be long. I tried everything. I read the Christian psychologists. They didn't help a whole lot. I read the worldly psychologists. Sadly, at least they had enough knowledge on the mental aspect of grief. And they would show me, and they would say things. But they agreed, every one of them, the Christian and the non-Christian, they all agree. And we know this. Many of you have grieved in this building. There's many aspects to grief. There's many levels of grief. But all of them will say this. There's 7 major areas that you will grieve. Can I just say this quickly? In this grief, number 1, there's anger that you will deal with in your grief. I can say this, honestly, I have not been angry with God. How are you going to be angry at a God that saved your soul out of a devil's hell? How are you going to be angry at a God? I wouldn't have had Rachel if it wasn't for God. I haven't been angry at God. I got mad at some preachers. Talk about their wife. Say things about their wife. In my carnality, I'd say things like this. God, why didn't you take their wife? They don't love them. I got angry. Why? Because whatever the reason you're suffering grief, and there's many reasons for grief. It's not always death. Sometimes it's a divorce. Sometimes it's a loss of a career. Sometimes it's a storm that goes by and takes everything that you've worked for. There's many reasons for your grief. But in your grief, you will suffer from anger. Not only is there anger, 7 major areas. Number 2, there's a bargaining in your grief. You'll try to bargain your way out of this grief. I remember in Pittsburgh, I would lie on that dirty hospital floor. God, I preach every night, but God, I'll preach 3 times a night. God, I try to read my Bible every day. God, I'll read my Bible 10 hours a day. But there's a problem, bargaining. It does not change your situation. But you'll try to bargain your way out of this grief. Not only is there anger, there's bargaining. There's number 3, there's a denial of your grief. I drove here yesterday thinking, my Rachel loved you and your family. How much she would have loved this. She also would have got a picture autographed and hung in our bedroom. She also would have done that. My Rachel, she would have loved this. It's hard to think that I came here today without her. There's a denial. God, is this really real? Is this true? Number 4, there's an acceptance in your grief. Whatever the reason you're grieving. I preach to people every night that God wants to use in a mighty way, but He can't. Because you have never reached the point of acceptance in your grief. There's ladies that you have babies in heaven growing up with Jesus, but they've never got past the fact that God took that baby. Whatever the reason for your grief, there must come a day of acceptance. 7 major areas. Not only is there acceptance, but number 5, and I know we're Baptist. Well, I'm not a good Baptist. I try to be a good Christian. Care less about the rest of that. But anyhow, but I know we're in a Baptist church. But if you're grieving, there is anxiety in your grief. And if you do not deal with the anxiety, it will lead to depression. I'd never suffered from anxiety until grief overtook my body. I began to study Calvary. We understand many reasons for anxiety. Worry is a major reason for anxiety. Jesus never worried. Jesus knows the future. Jesus is in control. But there is a physical anxiety. And I believe even before Calvary, the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus suffered with great drops of blood and sweat. It was physical. Can I say to the children of God, it is not a sin to suffer from anxiety. Though the cause may be a sin, but there is a physical reason for anxiety. But if you do not deal with the anxiety because of your grief, it will lead to your depression. These 7 major areas. Number 6, there's the shock of your grief. I'm almost done. They told me that Rachel was gone. My mind, not my body, my mind went into shock. We had a celebration, we had a funeral service, and I remember Brother Joe Arthur was there. He preached. Brother Brian McBride, Brother John. We had 6 preachers there. My friend, Brother Barry Smith, and he's a preacher, but I didn't have him because he's a preacher. He sang with George Jones for 6 years. I'm thinking he's got to be there. But anyhow, he gets up there and he quotes chiseled in stone, and I was crying. I was just crying, and we had an amazing time. At least that's what they tell me. Oh, I was sitting there, maybe 15 feet from my Rachel's body. But I don't remember nothing. I was in shock in my mind. All of these things you will suffer in your grief. Everything that I mentioned, and certainly many more things, but everyone, no matter the reason for your grief, no matter the reason for the pain and the agony, you'll suffer all of these things. But just for a moment in closing, number 7, I want to deal with the guilt in your grief. I don't understand all this, but I believe it. God healed Rachel's cancer the first time. And he could have done it the next time. But it was his choice not to heal Rachel. Can I take it a step further? It was God's will for Rachel to get her cancer back. It was God's purpose for Rachel to go to heaven. So young, so early. But yet in all these months, I felt so guilty. I remember in March of 2023, I was in Pennsylvania. My friend took me to the Poconos, and I love to hike, and we went hiking, and they showed me these waterfalls. And we had a wonderful day, just a perfect weather day, 72 degrees and sunny, and just an amazing day. And I remember we ended up going to Reading, Pennsylvania, a couple hours from there where we was at. And they took me to Tony's to have a cheesesteak. And it's such a great place to go. It was about a 30-minute wait. And I noticed a little record shop around the corner, and it was in the basement. Can I make this statement? If you find a record shop in the basement, you better go. It's a good one. I'm telling you, we did that. And I found some Johnny Cash records on vinyl. Praise the Lord. You say, did you have? Yeah, I had them, but I duplicated. I got more. It's Johnny Cash, man. But anyhow, and I seen some Bob Dylan records. I couldn't afford them. They are so expensive these days. I wanted the Bob Dylan records, but I had a wonderful time. And we went back and we got the cheesesteak. And I remember he was in that F2. He just got a brand new F-250 King Ram, beautiful truck, $100,000. And he's not a full-time pastor, by the way. Anyhow, we sat down in that truck and I'm eating that cheese, having an amazing day. I got back to his house. It was late that night. I laid down in my room and I began to thank God. Finally, I had one whole day. It was a good day. And then instantly, I felt guilty. Because Rachel didn't have that day. Rachel didn't see in my ignorance. She's just in heaven. She's just seeing the greatest thing. But anyhow, in my grief, I felt guilty. Can I say this? And I'll give you the verse and I'll be done. If it is God's will for your grief, you'll deal with all the other things. But you don't have to feel the guilt if it was the plan of God. In Isaiah 53, just for a moment, he's referring directly to Israel. We know that. We understand that. We believe that he's speaking to Israel. In verse number 1, he asks these questions: who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? That simply means this: who is it in Israel that's going to have enough faith to believe God? Who is it, that arm of the Lord, that refers to the power and the might of God? Who is it that's going to have the power of God? Thinking in my religious mind, it must be some great prophet, it must be some great man of faith to have that much faith, to have the power of God that is revealed unto them. But it's an amazing thing when you study the Bible correctly. Watch verse number 2. For he, Jesus, shall go up before him, referring to Israel. Watch this. That is a strong, mighty plant, a tender plant. Something that's very weak. Watch verse 2. And as a root not out of prosperous fruitful ground, but dry ground, he hath no form nor comeliness. And when we shall see him, Israel, there is no beauty outwardly that we should desire him. What is he? Verse 3. He is despised and rejected of men. Notice this: a man of sorrows. And watch the language of the Bible. And he's acquainted with our griefs. 3 times, I'll read this and I'll be done. 3 times you'll find that English word grief. Grief is a sickness. Grief is sorrow. Oh, Jesus, we talked about the deity of Christ this morning. He was all God, not ceasing to be all man. He was all man, not ceasing. He was all God in the flesh. He was perfect. He was holy. He was tempted in all ways as you and I are tempted, yet without sin. He could not sin. We understand this. For the wages of sin is death. The reason there's cancer, it's sin. The reason there's hospitals, it's sin. The reason there's cemeteries, it's sin. But Jesus never sinned. I don't believe he ever had a headache. He was so perfect. I don't believe he ever had a sniffle. He was so perfect. I don't believe he ever had to worry about a virus. He was so perfect. The only sickness that he ever felt was grief. He's acquainted with your grief. Watch the Bible. Verse number 3, we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised. We esteemed him not. Surely, here it is again. Watch this word. He hath borne our griefs. That's an amazing word. That literally means this: when he sees the grief that is laid upon us, he has literally picked it up. He has literally carried our griefs. Not only is he acquainted with our grief, but he wants to carry your grief. He wants to take your grief from you. He knows exactly how your grief is. He has borne our grief. Watch the Bible. Not only has he borne our griefs, but he carried our sorrows. Yet Israel, we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God. Why? Because he knew what grief was. We thought something was wrong and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised, literally crushed for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. With his stripes we were healed. Every one of us. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment. Who shall declare his generation? Why? For he was cut off of the land of the living. Why? For the transgressions of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Why? Because he, Jesus, hath done no violence, neither was there any deceit in his mouth. You know what Isaiah just said? He done nothing to deserve this grief. He done nothing to feel the sorrow and the affliction of his people. But I'm interested in this verse, and I'm done. Look at verse number 10. Can I say three things in closing? Look at the pleasure of his grief. He did nothing to deserve it. There was no deceit in his mouth. Yet, it pleased the Lord to do what? To bruise him. That is not the bruise that we refer to as some medical terminology, as something blue and purple popping open on our skin. That has nothing to do with that. It means simply they crush him. Watch the Bible. It pleased the Lord to crush him. Why would a God that loved his only begotten Son not only find it necessary, but to be pleased in crushing him? We see the pleasure of his grief. Number two, look at the place of his grief. It pleased the Lord to bruise him, to crush him. What has he done? He, God, he hath put him to grief. God put him in that place. I know the soldiers nailed him there, but they didn't put him there. I know Pilate sent him there, but Pilate didn't put him there. The God that loved him put him to grief. God, I know you love me, but you put me there. God, I believe you're a God of miracles. God, I believe you can take care of my problems. And he can, and he has. But sometimes God will put you in a place that you don't understand. And then instead of saying, God, why have you done this? Maybe I should be asking God, God, I know you've done this. It's you that put me here. Ma'am, I don't know why you're suffering. Sir, I have no idea why you're dealing with grief. But if you're in the hands of a sovereign God, and you are, God controls every step of your life. And if God would put his only begotten Son in a place of grief, who do I think I am that he would not put me? Can I say number three, and I'm done? I'm interested in the purpose of this grief. I don't know if this is possible, but could y'all get a song for invitation ready? Is that a possible? If y'all want to come on up and help us with that. Watch the Bible. Not only does the Bible say that he put him in this place, he bruised him. But why did he do it? He answers his own question in verse 10. Here's why. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin. Do you know why you're saved tonight? Because God was willing to put his only begotten Son in a place of grief. You know why I'm on my way to heaven tonight? Because God loved me so much. His only Son, he crushed him and he put him to a place of grief. Here's the message. I could question God the rest of my life. Why'd you take my Rachel? God, you can heal cancer. You've done it before. You can do it again. God, why? I could ask him that question the rest of my life. Or I could finally take a step forward. Say, God, I'll never understand it. But there's always purpose for the pain in the life of your children. Just maybe God has a plan.